Hello and welcome to Chapter 15, The Bureaucracy, from the American Government Textbook, 3rd edition of Open Stax. You can see here, we're talking about bureaucracy and how it's maneuvered here in the United States of America and how over time things have had to change in the system. You can see here a political cartoon from 1885 of disappointed individuals who were seeking a position within within the bureaucracy, but of course, to disappointment, it did not. So, the many arms of the federal bureaucracy are often considered the fourth branch of government. Of course, it's the administrative structure. It's the behind the scenes people. The people that make the government run at the federal level. Of course, this administrative structure is staffed by non-elected workers, and of course enables the government to function of the needs of the U.S. citizens. So, at the federal level, for American citizens, when you're filling out, for a U.S. passport, or you're trying to get a Social Security card, many things of that federal matter. Of course, there are people behind the scenes that make sure they get that work done. So, of course, you can see here the cabinet, the cabinet of George Washington, which you see here in the far left, and his individuals, of course, his four cabinet members. Of course, this at the time represented a small portion of the U.S. government in the 18th century. So what is bureaucracy? It's an administrative group of non-elected officials charged with carrying out functions connected to the series of policies and programs. Like I just mentioned earlier, with Social Security, passport, and other such things that needs to be done at the federal level. There are individuals behind the scenes getting that done. A bureaucrat is an individual who works in the bureaucracy and fills the necessary instrumental roles in areas of the government. So from high-level positions to low-level positions, there are people who are called bureaucrats. And these bureaucrats are there. They are individuals who work their day-to-day, no matter who is elected into the federal position level of the United States president. So, of course, there has been evolution of bureaucracy in the U.S. And so the first part, right, in the rise of the centralized party politics in 1820s, of course, then we had a lot of loyalists. So at a time, if you were a party loyalist, you would earn a position within the government. So what would happen is every time there was a new president, the previous administration's individuals who worked in the government would all be fired, and then those positions would be filled in by individuals by the new president. So every administration, there'd be a whole completely new people working for the federal government. Could you imagine if we still abide by that in this day? Can you imagine if a new president was in office, that came in office and then fired every single individual in the previous administration that was non-elected or non-appointed, fire them and then replace them with somebody new? Things would be chaotic, especially the size of the United States today, and of course the size of the things that need to happen. So industrialization in the late 19th century increased both the population and economic size. So we needed to have civil servants, which of course civil servants are individuals who are non-elected, non-appointed individuals who work there, no matter who the president is or no matter what parties in government, they work there day to day. The fall of political patronage practices led to the creation of the Civil Service Reform Act. Basically, it created a commission or a centralized agency with hiring civil servants through a merit system. So the merit system is basically you qualify for that position, and if the position required, you had a test for that position. So, for example, one of the positions as a civil servant, if you want to work for an embassy or a consulate across the country, you would have to, of course, work for the U.S. State Department, and of course, you would have to take the civil service exam in order to qualify for one of those roles. Because you can see here another individual, who was mad and of course shot James Garfield because he was not given a position. So of course we see another evolution of the bureaucracy in the U.S. Part 2, right? The establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Trade Commission gave rise to the bureaucratic growth in the early 20th century. During the Great Depression of 1929, a number of government and civil jobs were created to revive the economy. Federal bureaucracy expanded again. So, of course, each decade added more state and federal programs, which, of course, once you add more programs and more You add more programs, you have more departments, that creates a whole new bureaucrat to run that. So of course here, Ronald Reagan always wants to distance himself from the bureaucratic machines. So you have civil service hiring and pay practices. Excuse me. So there was a hiring practice and structure of pay systems. So when you work for the federal government as a civil servant, there are pay scales, depending on the job, and depending on the job of the level you are, you get a different pay scale. So of course, there are also present examinations and civil service exams that help determine your required abilities and qualifications. Again, it's based on the U.S. Federal General Schedule, and of course, it provides a clear structure for merit-based advancement. So of course, tell us, one review question here. Briefly explain the benefits and drawbacks of a merit system. What do you think the merits and the drawbacks are of a merit system? So think about it yourself. Talk it amongst your classmates if you are in the class, and think about that. So of course, historically, African Americans have gravitated to the civil service large numbers. So you can see here there's still battles to go, with racial discrimination going on amongst individuals at the federal level, and that's of course, trying to do our best to avoid that. The U.S. Office of Personnel Management regulates hiring practices. The three models for understanding bureaucracy. So you have the Weberian model, the acquisitive model, and the monopolistic model. The first one, the Weberian model, is a classic model of bureaucracy. Agencies are apolitical, hierarchically organized, governed by a formal procedure. So you have a hierarchy system that people have to follow, chain of command. The acquisitive model proposes that bureaucracies are naturally competitive and power hungry. And of course, they will work towards enhancing their own status. So an acquisitive model, each bureaucracy doesn't care about the other. They're trying to fight for their power and trying to fight to be at the top to make sure they get funding. And the monopolistic model is that in its absence of competition, that provides the greatest insight into how bureaucracy works. So here is a general schedule that we talked about in a few slides about the pay range. So GS1 is the lowest level and GS15 is the highest level. And of course, you can see here each higher grade typically requires a high level of education. GS1, no qualifying amount. GS2 requires a high school diploma. GS5 requires 4 years of education. GS9 requires a master's or a graduate, and so on and so on. And of course, GS13 and above, appropriate specialized experience is required for all positions. So if you are, say, for example, GS9, you have to have a master's degree or higher. And of course, you can see here the pay scale goes higher. So different types of federal bureaucracies. You have the cabinet departments, or the major executive offices that, of course, are accountable to the president. So cabinet departments, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, Attorney General, the Secretary of Labor, and all those, Secretary of Education. Those are cabinet departments, and the individuals in each who had those cabinets report directly to the president. You have the independent executive agencies and regulatory agencies that report directly to the president but are assigned a more focused task. And of course, you have government corporations. These are agencies formed by the federal government to administer a quasi-business enterprise. So a government corporation, an example, would be the U.S. Postal Service Office. Amtrak is another government corporation. These corporations, right, they're not privately owned. You can't invest in it through stocks or, so they're quasi, work as a private business, function as a private business, but supported by the government. So you can see here the multi-levels of the State Department. So you can see here at the very top of this huge bureaucracy hierarchy model, you can see here at the top the Secretary of State, who was charged, and of course each individual's that underneath them is who helps them lead that office and individuals working there. So you can see then that's just one department. That's just one cabinet level position, right? The other departments, excuse me, have similar roles. Overseeing bureaucracy, right? Congress, excuse me, is empowered to apply oversight of the federal bureaucracy because it's powered to control the funding. And so, of course, one of the most powerful oversights is the Government Accountability Office. The president controls the bureaucracy by appointing the head of the 15 cabinet departments and, of course, other independent executive agencies. So independent executive agencies would be such as CIA, FBI, and the EPA. the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, the office also conducts oversight through the Office of Management and Budget. So you can see here NASA, which is considered an independent executive agency. You know, you can see here an example of one. And the thing about independent executive agencies is that since they don't fall under a department, they have a leeway in regards to bureaucracy, in regards to, you know, that agency only responds to the United States, the president, but they also have to fight for funding as well with the departments and other agencies. With overseeing bureaucracy, there's been a citizen bureaucratic oversight through two laws: the Freedom of Information Act of 1996 and the Government in the Sunshine Act of 1976. So, of course, the Freedom of Information Act, you've probably heard in the news when an agency, the newspaper agency or such, investigators are trying to get information from the government. They can apply for this to get documentation. However, there are times when they receive documentation and a lot of the information provided is blacked out. And of course, the government can say, you know, it's because of national security reasons. So that's of course one of the reasons. Of course, bureaucrats were some of the most recently developed laws of the Negotiated Ruling Acts of 1990, 1996. Of course, rulemaking procedures. Of course, you can see, had the U.S. government not created Amtrak in the 1970s, passenger rail system service might have ceased to exist in the United States. So I've actually personally have taken Amtrak myself. It's a great service for those who need in economic ways of getting around from town to town, major town to major town. And of course, for those who don't like to fly, it's a great option. Privatization is a controversial solution to perceived and real inefficiencies in the bureaucracy. So there are three types of privatization: divestiture or full privatization, which occurs when government services are transferred through a sale, and of course that's when a government service has become private. So of course that is one. Privatization of part. Right, the issuing of government contracts to private companies in order to provide them necessary services is also another form of privatization. One, of course, is the federal prisons given to a company to run for them. So that is another form of privatization that occurs, and of course that has itself been controversial. Then, of course, third-party financing is a complex form of privatization where the federal government signs an agreement with the private entity so to conform a special purpose to take ownership of being financed. So just a review question, just to recap here, bureaucracy. Briefly explain amongst yourselves why government might create a government corporation. So we talked about privatization, we talked about semi-government bureaucracy, so like such as Amtrak and the U.S. Postal Service. So I'll explain why they might create a government corporation. Of course, here is the Freedom of Information Act. Of course, again, the black marks cover information the CIA deemed particularly sensitive. So that is from something from the Freedom of Information Act that you may get if you apply for one to get information. You may get a lot of documentation blacked out. Thank you for joining me for this chapter of Bureaucracy from the American Government Textbook, 3rd edition from Open Stax.